Now, some of you may have already taken the Rigging Fundamentals course, and awesome if you have, but we're just going to do a little bit of a recap and a crash course on to cover all the stuff that we need to know for this particular course. Firstly, some terminology. Now, some of this is going to be really obvious, but when I say mesh, I'm talking about the polygon objects. That is the object that has the vertices inside it. Now, for a monster truck rig, there's going to be many different polygon objects. Some rigs might have different types of objects like curves for the springs or whatever, but for us in this course, everything is a polygon object. Now, what is a rig? That can be used interchangeably with the word armature, which is the thing that controls the actual character or the car in our circumstance. It can also be called a control rig. Now, rig can be composed of many different objects, but essentially, most of the time we're talking about the one armature object that the animator will control. And for a monster truck, we'll only have one armature. Now, what is a widget? Well, a widget could also be called a gizmo or a custom bone shape. This is just another object that is used to replace the default shape of our bone. That way we can get a nice and pretty rig. Now, what is a helper or a helper mesh? This can be two things. This could be something that we build in the rigging process to help make the rigging process go smoother, or it could be something that we need to add to our rig to make it function properly. You might need one part to stick to another, so you might actually have a shrink wrap mesh, which will be a helper, and it won't be visible in any of the renders, but one object sticks to that mesh, and that mesh sticks to another object. For example, that would be a helper object. Now, if you're only using it to help you in the rigging process, it doesn't end up being part of your final rig, but if it is needed for the final rig to function, then it would be included in the rig per se. Some rigging fundamental concepts. As you already know from the last course, there are three main purposes for any particular bone. We've got control bones, we've got deformation bones, and we've got mechanism bones. The control bones, these are the ones that the animator will actually move around. The deformation bones, they are controlling the deformation. They deform the mesh object. And the mechanism bones are needed to help the rig do what you need it to do through constraints and parenting and possibly even drivers. Now, what are some good practice techniques? So building on what we've just spoken about, bones should have one single purpose. Now, I don't mean that only one bone can have one constraint or something like that. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about deformation bones should only be the deformation bones. They shouldn't be control bones as well. This is something that I used to do when I was being lazy, and I don't want to pass this bad habit on. It's really good practice to have all your deformation bones as deformation bones only. That way they're nice and neat when you're doing your weight painting in the vert groups. It's just a really easy way to work. Next, be consistent. This is with everything. The naming convention, the bone shape designs that you give it, the bone colors, everything should be consistent and logical. If you use front and back on one part, don't use forward and rear on another. It's just logical things like that. If you constrain a bone to a particular target on one side of the car, make sure you do it the same on the other. Don't be mixing and matching. Just be consistent. And finally, be logical. This can mean many things. For example, there's many places that you can create a custom property, so you need to think of the most logical place to put it. There's also many ways of doing the same thing. So you need to decide as a rigger what is the most logical way for you and your workflow. And don't be afraid to try a few things out and go, oh, it's not logical for me to do that. It takes me longer to do it that way. And sometimes making something more complicated will give it more flexibility, but you need to weigh that up against whether it's logical or not. It's not always better. But most importantly, you need to learn from your mistakes. And believe me, you will make a lot of mistakes. But trust me when I say making mistakes is actually a good thing, because you learn the lesson the hard way, and that will actually make the information sink in for longer and stronger. Next, let's talk about the naming convention. Now, in the previous course, I've spoken at length about choosing a good naming convention and the reasons behind it. So I won't do that again, but I will go over the changes in this course. I'll be sticking to the main concepts behind the Rigify naming convention. Now, what am I talking about? Mainly about our bone prefixes. In the last course, I was using suffixes. In this course, we're going to use prefixes. That is, our deformation bones will have the DEF at the start. Our mechanism bones will have the MCH at the start. And our control bones won't have anything at the start, because that is redundant, because these are the only controls that the animator will have access to. And if everything has a control on it, CTRL, there's no point. It's redundant. Now, why the change? Now, I've thought long and hard about this, and I think as an educator, it's best if I teach a way that is more universally accepted across the board. I think the more people who are on the same page, the better. kind of like the library system. If everyone uses the same system, you can go into any library and find what you're looking for. But if I start a library and I organize things by color, my library might look awesome, but no one's going to know how to find it. That's a weird analogy. I'll probably cut it out. The other main reason why we're sticking to a Rigify naming system by having prefixes is because we're going to be doing some fancy stuff with Python. And as I mentioned in that course, it makes more sense when you have a naming convention like that if you're doing some fancy stuff with Python, which we're going to be doing. But that's all the changes. It's not a big thing. You'll pick it up as we go along. That's it for this video. I'll see you in the next one.